Hello, Trinity Grace. Albert here. I'd like to share part 2 of the elders' message as we continue to face the pandemic. Last week we introduced a 5-week pastoral letter / video message, and I said that we would go through 5 questions to really think through as followers of Christ as the pandemic continues. The elders want to encourage our faith personally and corporately because you don't face a pandemic every day. And so we all need wisdom and help to find our bearings and navigate to the other side for the better. I realize it's been over a year already. And in some ways, just to repeat something I said last week, I wish we sent something out like this sooner, but better late than never. We hope that this series of messages will help you think through important and pertinent matters of faith. And we hope to minimize pandemic side effects on our faith and to maximize continued maturation and growth as Christ's church. Each week, again, we'll pose a question and unpack thoughts around that question. We aim to provide, with each question, 2 ends of healthy Christian tension that should be on the believer's conscience, we believe, as we continue to face the pandemic. So today's question is, how will we worship our God in a worthy manner? Now, why do we ask this question? Because certainly the pandemic has affected our worship. Now, let's ask the question, what is worship? Worship is, first of all, multi-layered and multifaceted. That is to say, despite that, what is simple, clear, and certain is that loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength is the greatest commandment. Our highest calling, our eternal goal as Christ followers and even as human beings is to worship our Trinity God, Father, Son, and Spirit. And the Bible is replete with evidence pointing to the worship of God being our highest calling. God's intention throughout history, if you read the Bible from beginning to end, there's a clear theme. God's intention throughout history has been consistently to call out a people in body and soul to be His people and for Him to be their God. To cite a few examples, we see this from Adam and Eve, right from the get-go in creation, to Israel's exodus out of Egypt, to Christ's conversation with the woman at the Samaritan woman at the well, and ultimately Christ's church in the new creation. So in summary, what is worship? Worship is God's highest call to be His people and to love Him with all our heart, our soul, and our strength as His people. Well, let's get practical. How do we live out this greatest commandment then? How do we worship? As mentioned earlier, worshiping God for certain is multi-layered and multifaceted. Worship first begins with a posture of the heart. That's why there's that beautiful song, The Heart of Worship. Worship is first about an orientation and posture of the heart. You could say even the deepest attitude. On this side of eternity then, it's important to understand we will never get our outward conduct and expression of worship perfect. But the important thing is that first it starts in the heart and we try to work it out from the inside out. Therefore, next, worship overflows into a continual lifestyle. I think we see this in the Old Testament, but for certain it's made clear in the New Testament that worship is a holistic lifestyle. Paul beautifully captures that in his letter to the Romans in the 12th chapter, verses 1 to 2. And so as the Apostle Paul teaches not only there, but in other letters, a similar thought, whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all for the glory of God in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. So our attitude of worship is the undercurrent for everything we say and do, and that overflows into a continual lifestyle. An essential element of our worship lifestyle worth spotlighting, then, is, personally speaking, is our personal fellowship with the Lord. That's why we speak of a relationship with Christ, and primarily through meditating on the Scriptures and praying to Him. But next, worship from that lifestyle, and within that lifestyle, is especially symbolized, strengthened, and expressed through our weekly Lord's Day gatherings. That's a very significant and specific expression of our worship lifestyle. The church certainly has other rhythms and deliberate gatherings, but the Lord's Day worship is a very specific and significant gathering and just part of this lifestyle. We see this in the New Testament in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, and in other places. You can get all these references in the email version of this letter from the elders, so check that out if you want more references. But on the Lord's Day, we gather for the Lord's table to sing psalms and hymns and to hear the preaching of the gospel. And the Lord's Day, in particular, reminds us that we are here's a beautiful Greek word for you, ecclesia. And that means the called out ones. We're called out and assembled as God's people, His people of the new covenant in Christ, of grace. And so our corporate gathered worship, it really is, I hope you really take this in, it's a preview of the new creation that we see in Revelation 21, 1-4, made possible by the resurrection of Christ. The gathering of God's people to dwell with God on the Lord's Day, celebrating the resurrection of Christ and breaking bread and taking the cup at the Lord's table is a preview of that final marriage supper of the Lamb and the church being gathered and presented as Christ's bride to Christ. What we must ask then is, how has the pandemic affected our worship? Because we would be remiss if we didn't stop to evaluate the effects of the pandemic on our worship. Look, you read magazines and articles and so forth all out there. Everyone knows, everyone accepts that this pandemic has changed all of us in real significant ways. And as Christ followers, we must admit that the pandemic has affected our worship. Now, on the one hand, the pandemic has offended the core of our worship. The pandemic, more negatively speaking, has challenged an expression of our highest calling as Christ followers. And therefore, the pandemic, you must understand and accept the reality that it has even challenged your identity. I hope you feel it. And if you don't, this is why we're making this series of letters and messages, so that you would think through how the pandemic is affecting you as a Christ follower and your faith. The pandemic has challenged the expression of our highest calling as Christ followers to worship God as His physically gathered people freely. According to the Barna Research Group, church attendance has fallen approximately a third across the world during the pandemic. It's unbelievable. Now, on the other hand, and speaking a bit more positively, the pandemic has hypercharged what we'll call a new virtual reality. And I know right off the bat, some people might think, no, that's a negative thing. But there have been some redemptive aspects to this. Now, admittedly, the virtual approach to worship and ministry, I have to acknowledge, and the elders see it, that it's created some new opportunities that were not obvious before for ministry. For example, I'll just state two quick examples. Did you know that there's an Arabic Bible church in Ottawa, and they have been able to expand their reach to connect with believers in Beirut? This includes a Kurdish family that is in Lebanon as refugees. The adult son of this family offered to begin a Kurdish Bible study using Arabic Bible Church's Zoom account. And soon a group, even including those who are not yet Christians, was meeting weekly. And with this online format, participants are joining in from Lebanon, Ottawa, and Hamilton. And this was not on the radar of normal tactics before the pandemic. And for certain, we need to acknowledge that God has redeemed this virtual situation to increase reach to more people that we were not able to reach prior. Even in our own church, we have had, for a fact, spiritually seeking friends join our services online where they did not join us in person prior. Of course, ultimately, we want them to join us in person, but at least they're taking steps towards getting connected to the church. And there are many more similarly redemptive stories. Nevertheless, as helpful as the ability to gather virtually online has been, we must not be numbed to think that online worship is an ultimately acceptable form of worship. We must not be numbed and accept this notion that online worship is an ultimately acceptable form of worship. We, as Christ followers, we're called to labor by grace toward our final Revelation 21 reality, meaning the physically gathered, presented to Christ as his church bride, worshiping God as his people, God dwelling with us as we dwell with him, reality. That's the ultimate reality, and that's why Lord's Day gathering is so beautiful and precious to us. So, what is a healthy tension that I need to consider? I need to, and we're asking you to consider as the pandemic continues. And the tension basically can be boiled down to, in these times of pandemic, between worshiping God from a spirit-filled heart, having that posture of worship, and worshiping God from, on one hand, as a physically gathered community, and on the other hand, a virtual community online. On the one hand, we're pulled upward by the vision of ultimate reality in the new creation, the church as a glorified throng of redeemed souls in new physical bodies, and we must pine for this new creation reality and labor to live it out here on earth until the final consummation. On the other hand, we experience real impediments like pandemic-induced lockdowns and government restrictions to physical gatherings. Virtual, online, on-screen worship gatherings are a helpful yet imperfect accommodation to our inability to assemble physically. So let me leave you some questions. I hope you will prayerfully consider these questions. Have I thought about my call to worship God in the terms outlined in this little message? Is worshiping God on every level, from attitude to lifestyle to being the physically gathered people of God and Church of Christ, is that on the front burner of my reason for existing? Do I find myself pained that we cannot gather, as much as I am grateful for online church? Is physically gathered worship a commitment for which I'm willing to sacrifice? Or am I at risk of letting other factors like a desire for safety or a preference for convenience, am I at risk of letting these things overshadow the importance of gathering as a church? What are other factors I need to consider in addition to the call of worshiping God? For example, what does it mean to love my neighbor during the pandemic? Which we'll get to next week, because that's the second question. To end, I want to remind us all of the elders' motive and desire in this series of pastoral messages. And the motive is to present Trinity Grace Church as blameless and spotless to Christ as we can. May you be encouraged to prayerfully think upon the thoughts in this message, this video version of the letter. And please feel free to reach out to the elders if you have any questions or would like to talk about the letter or the message that was communicated in this video. Grace and peace to you from Albert, Colin, and Trevor. Bye.